Hi guys and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with the next installment of my 1 week month palette, and we're going to discuss the Going Coconuts palette by Colourpop today. But before we jump into the palette, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. But let's just start going through the details of this palette. So I've had this palette for quite a while now. I picked it up at the beginning of this year, but I actually hadn't used it before this project, so it was complete kind of first impression for me as well. After using it for a week, I do really like it, but I'm going to get into some more details later on in the video. But let's just start going through what the palette looks like and all of the swatches. So here you can see what the palette looks like. You have a good range of just kind of matte browns, and the reason why I picked this up, because obviously I have quite a few neutral palettes in my collection already, but what kind of pulled me into this palette is because it has a lot of tones that I am lacking in my collection. They're more kind of camely on the cooler side, which yeah, I just felt like there were unique tones in my collection. But I have swatched out all of the shades here on my arm. I'm going to try to awkwardly show you. That is what the palette looks like. So we go from here, we have like a light skin tone color, a light shimmer, which is like, it has like a golden shift to it. I'm not sure how much you can pick up on camera. Then we have two transition shades right there. This one is a bit more cool tone and this one is a bit kind of warmer, but they are very similar, as you can see, which is one of my kind of negatives about the palette, but I will get into that later on when I talk about the looks. We have the most beautiful shimmer right here, which is the middle of the palette, and then we have another transition shade which is slightly deeper. I'm actually wearing this one today. We have one of those kind of matte with glitter shades right here, another deeper shimmer, and then lastly this deep matte. So that is the look of the palette and everything. And like I said, I have some feedback to give you, but I'm gonna go through the looks as I always do first. So we're gonna start with the first day, which I decided to do an all matte look, and I started off with the shade Lovely Bunch, which is this one right here in my I know it's called Lovely Bunch.
I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts.
Deedly deedly.
There they are, standing in a row.
Should I keep this in?
Yes.
So I'm starting off with the shade Lovely Bunch in the crease, and then I decided to take the shade Shell Yeah, both to define the crease as well as on my lower lash line. Then I went in with the shade Nutty right here on my outer corner as well as my lower lash line, just in the outer corner. And then I did a cut crease with my concealer, and I topped that off with Shredded, which is the lighter shade here. And lastly I used this shimmery shade Palm Reader in my inner corner. And then for day 2, I decided to go for a bit more of a lighter makeup look. I didn't film this day, so that's why I didn't want to do something too crazy. And I started off with the shade Colada, which is this cooler transition shade up in the corner. And then I used Get Crackin' in the outer corner, which is this matte with the shimmers down here. Then on my lid I used Cocoa Crush, which is this beautiful shimmer here in the center. And then lastly I used Palm Reader again in the inner corner. So for day 3 I went for a halo eye, and I didn't really like how this came out. I started off with Lovely Bunch again in the crease, which was this shade right here. Then I took Shell Yeah, which is this kind of more reddish tone shade right here, and I used that both in my outer corner and in the corner as well as on my lower lash line. Then what I did is I just took Nutty, which is this darker shade down here, and used Deepened up my outer corner. And lastly I used Palm Reader, which is this lighter shade again, both in the center of my lid as well as my inner corner. Then for day 4 we have a little bit of a fail, because I actually didn't do my makeup this day. I just had a no makeup day. I just wasn't feeling it. We are in lockdown, so I do my makeup for me anyway. I don't really go and see anyone, so this day I just did not feel like doing makeup, so unfortunately I don't have a look for day 4, so we're gonna move on to day number 5. So with day number 5 I did more of a winged out eye look. I have two, actually this day and the next day are both winged out looks, but this is the more dramatic out of the two. I used some tape to kind of get that sharp edge, and then I started off with the shade Colada, which is this cool tone brown again, and put that in my crease as well as my lower lash line. Then I took the shade Nutty, which is this dark brown again, on my outer corner. Then on my lid, so like all over my lid, I took this beautiful shade the Cocoa, which is a shimmer shade. And then lastly in my inner corner I used Palm Reader again. When I did use Nutty, I kind of focused that also on the wings to create that like sharp edge, but I really love how this look came out, and I think this is actually one of my favorite looks that I created with this palette. Then for day 6, you could say that this is kind of the lighter version of the last look. I used it a really light eye with a winged out shadow liner. So I put some tape down used to create that sharpness for the wing, and then in my crease I actually took a mix of Lovely Bunch and Shredded, which are these two right here, just because I wanted a really light transition shade, and I didn't want anything as deep as these, although they're not super deep, but I just wanted to lighten it up. So I added some of Shredded and put that in my crease. Then I used Cocoa Crush again and put that all over my lid, and that's basically all I did for my eye. And then for my wing I used the shade Nutty again, which is this deepest brown down here, and just winged that out and smoked it out a little bit on my upper lash line. Then we are up to the look that I have on today. I'm gonna scooch a bit closer so you can see what it looks like. But majority of my eyes today is with the shade Shell Yeah, which is this kind of reddish brown right there. So I actually put that all up in my crease as well as all over my lid as a base. Then what I did is I took the shade Da Cocoa and put that kind of all over my lid on top of that Shell Yeah shade. And then kind of to deepen up the outer corner I used the shade Nutty, which is this deep brown again. And I really love that, and as you can see I use that most of the days to deepen up my outer corner. Then, since I wanted some more brightness in the center of my lid, I took the shade Cocoa Crush again and put that on the center of the lid. And I also used a mix of Cocoa Crush and Palm Reader in the corner today, because I didn't want anything as bright as Palm Reader on its own. And then the last shade I used today is the shade Shredded, which is this one right here. And I used that to kind of blend out the edges of the shade Shell Yeah. So there you have all the looks that I created over the last week, and obviously we had a new shade palette in this week. The looks weren't going to be as different than some of the other looks that I've done before in the series, but overall I feel like with this palette a lot of the shades are quite similar when you swatch them out or on the eyes. I feel like both of these two are very similar. Even this kind of dark brown with the glitter in it is very similar. It's just slightly deeper, as you can see. But if you take them with a very light hand, it actually comes across as very similar to these two transition shades. So I'm going to show you which ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about this shade right here, this shade right here, and then this shade right here. So they definitely look different in the palette. This one and this one definitely have the same kind of tone, but this is obviously a bit deeper. And then this one definitely looks a bit warmer, but as you can see on the eyes and in the swatches, they look very similar. So although this is a super good neutral palette, and if you're looking for something a bit more cool tone but not grey, this is absolutely the best palette that I have in my collection. I actually have a palette that I'm going to talk about later, which might be the palette for next month. That is also a cool tone palette, but the tones are actually a bit different than this one. I might just pull it up to show you, because I think a lot of people have this in their collection. So the palette I'm talking about is the Sultry palette, and as you can see, I mean, there is some overlapping in tones, but I would say this one is definitely a bit more kind of grey leaning, whereas this one has a bit more just browns. Again, obviously there is some overlapping shades, but for example, if you take Twig, which is the shade right here, it's more of a grey leaning brown than some of the shades in here. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like it's more of a cool brown rather than kind of cool leaning grey or leaning silver, or just kind of these pearly tones, which this palette has more of. I don't know if that's a good explanation, but that's one of the reasons why I really love this palette. But I just wish there was a little bit more variety with it. So what I would have wished is maybe that this one would have, I do like the shade, but maybe that this one would have been a little bit more cool and this one would have been a little bit more warm, just like a tiny bit. So the difference would have been a tiny bit more than it is currently. With the rest of the shades, I love Shredded. I think that's a really good shade to have a palette. I love Palm Reader. It's a super bright inner corner highlight and I love the shift in it. Cocoa Crush is one of the most beautiful shimmers I used in a long time in one of my Colourpop palettes, so I absolutely love this one. Shell Yeah, I do love as well. Like I said, it's what I have in my crease today, and I think it's a beautiful tone and it's quite a unique one too. And then Nutty is a very pigmented, easy to blend dark shade, which I absolutely love as well. So I feel like all of these are kind of the ones that I would say are my favorites. Then when it comes to shades like Da Cocoa and Get Crackin', They're not my absolute favorites because they're not just my preference, what I tend to use. Get Cracking is the one that I use the least. I think I only used this shade once, and I just don't love those matte with glitters. I tried to make the glitter show up, but it just didn't show up very well on my eyes. So it's mainly just performs like a matte, so it's not my like preference. And then when it comes to the Cocoa, which is the shade that I have on my list today, it's more of a satin shimmer. I mean, if you look at it on my finger, it definitely like shows up, but it's not as intense as some of the other shimmers. And I feel like I had to use it with a glitter glue today, and it did show up, but it's just not as intense as some of the shimmers that I do like, and it's also a bit too deep for me or for my preference. So those two shades I feel like could be really useful, but then just not what I love in a palette. But then when it comes to these two, obviously a translucent shade like this is useful, but I just wish that one of them either would have been switched out for something else, or that they would have been a bit more different, if that makes sense. But overall, I think this palette is absolutely stunning, and it's definitely something that I would recommend, especially for the price. I'm a bit torn currently with Colourpop if I want to continue supporting them because of their fast fashion kind of model that has kind of come up to the surface recently. I haven't purchased from them since when I purchased this, which was I think in January or February this year, so it's been quite a while. I'm not sure if I will purchase from them again. I might do in the future, but actually I may make an order quite soon because Raw Beauty Christie announced like 2 days ago that they're making a palette with Colourpop, and I am so excited for that. But I'm gonna try to just look for similar things in my collection because, like I said, I'm not super keen on purchasing from them right now. But I don't know, that's not the point of this palette. But anyway, I do think it's a beautiful neutral palette, but I don't know, I just feel a bit bored now. But I think that might also be that I have been playing with so much color during lockdown. I have been using tons and tons of different palettes. Obviously my Pandas eyeshadows, I have quite a few colorful shades in there for the last few months, so using an all neutral palette like this exclusively for a week just made me feel like the looks I created were a bit redundant. But if you're into fully neutral looks, or if you want something for like an everyday palette or like an office palette, I think this is a really good option. And I think with that we're gonna wrap up that palette. I do recommend it, but it's not the absolute perfect palette. Yeah, you can see like it's very kind of mid-tone, I would say. But it is a stunning palette, and I have really enjoyed wearing it over the last week. So let's move on to the section where we choose palettes for next month. Actually, I forgot to mention, but last month we had the Golden Coconuts and the Saharan 2 from Juvia's Place, and the Golden Coconuts palette actually only won by 1 vote. So I was really close to putting the Saharan 2 palette in for voting again this month, but I decided that I want to have something that I feel like a bit more festive, because obviously we're gonna do this in December. I will definitely bring back the Saharan 2 for another 1 week, 1 palette, maybe even next month or the month after. But for now I want to give it a chance to another 2 palettes. So I already talked about the Sultry palette. This is from Anastasia, and I believe this was a limited edition palette, but I've seen it on their website still, but I think it's much harder now to get a hold of. But I do know a lot of people have this in the collections, which is why I wanted to include it. And I also haven't played around with this too much. I have pan on one of the shades for my Pandas eyeshadows, but otherwise, yeah, I haven't really played around with most of the shades. So that is the first option. Then for the second option, I want to take a palette that I also haven't played around with too much, and that is the Francation palette from Dose and Colors. I do have pan on one of the shades, spoiler alert, because I'm currently working on them in one of my projects, but this is what the palette looks like. I haven't, again, used this too much. I played around with the screen I think 2 or 3 times because I absolutely love it. But I haven't worn like this blue, which I really want to wear, this kind of reddy tone, which I haven't worn either. And I think I played around with the mattes once, so it's a relatively new palette in my collection as well. And I think with these really unique shimmers, this would be another really good festive option. So those are the 2 palettes that are up for the next 1 week, 1 palette. Funny enough, they're my most sparkly palettes in my collection, but I just think these color stories are really good for the holiday season. And with that, I think we're gonna wrap up this video. So if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to vote for your kind of favorite palette down below, so you can help decide which palette is gonna be my next focus palette. And other than that, I hope you're having an amazing day, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye guys.